Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Nelischer. I'm a project manager with the City Building Institute at Ryerson University, and I'm here to tell you about a recent gallery exhibit. Some of you may have seen it. It was up at 401 Richmond this past fall, and it's focused on the impact that commercial property taxes are having on Toronto's main streets and small businesses. So this story starts in 2017. It actually started much earlier than that, but you may remember this kind of flurry of media activity around that time, around the recent property assessments across the city. Many businesses, particularly in the downtown areas of Toronto, were facing property tax increases of 100%, in some cases much higher than that. And this was the moment where we felt like the public really woke up to this issue. It was an issue that, of course, didn't begin in 2017, but this is a moment where there was a lot of public awareness raised around this. And that waking up was quite fruitful because against pressure from businesses and property owners and with support from communities and, of course, city councillors, in 2017, City Council passed two really key measures to ease the burden of these property tax increases. One of those was to create a new tax class for creative co-location spaces like 401 Richmond and some of the Artscape buildings. And the other was to cap the annual increases on property taxes for small businesses across the city at 10% annually. But in 2018, we at the City Building Institute, we were still hearing from our friends and colleagues and business owners that those measures weren't enough. They were still facing really burdensome property tax bills. And although the issue is no longer in the public eye, it certainly hadn't been solved and it hadn't gone away. This highest and best used property tax assessment methodology, which I'll get into in a little bit, was still being used, and it was still really threatening the fabric of these main streets and these businesses and cultural spaces that we all love. So at the City Building Institute, we are not tax experts, and that includes myself, but we wanted to find a way to take action on this issue. And one of the key ideas was that we wanted to communicate this issue, which is really complicated and really kind of policy wonky, but we wanted to introduce it in an accessible way to a more public audience. So what we wanted to do was tell the stories of these places, like the Silver Dollar Room, other music venues, businesses, main streets, that we were losing to the threat of commercial property tax, and make this issue a little bit more personal for people. So what we decided to do was take to the walls of Urban Space Gallery and use that as our canvas. So we mounted a free exhibit that combined photographs and stories and infographics to kind of illustrate this issue. So we started by interviewing the small businesses and property owners, as well as tax experts and elected officials. We partnered with Vic Pawa, whose photos you saw over your lunch break, and he went out and took really incredible shots from street level of some of the streets that were threatened and the businesses that were threatened and the sites that we were exploring. And we also partnered with Matt Blackett and Julie Fish of Spacing Magazine, who created these graphics and did the design and put our kind of mock-ups so they could fit on the wall. So our exhibit launched in 2019 with a panel that really focused on where do we go from here, what are the solutions. The exhibit itself was free to visit, and we hosted a few other events throughout its run to get people in the space and get their eyes on the show. One was titled Beer and Taxes, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then last week, or 2 weeks ago, the exhibit was remounted at City Hall, actually, as part of Tabia's BIA Week. So with the short time that I have here today, I really want to share with you some of the key outcomes of this research and some of our most striking findings. And so the images that I'll show over the next few slides are adapted from the exhibit itself. So as you're all aware from the talks you've heard here today, Toronto and your own experience, I'm sure Toronto has been facing really dramatic growth, especially in its downtown neighborhoods over the past few decades. But in these high growth areas, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, which is a provincial agency charged with determining property values, in these high growth areas, they use what they call a direct comparison approach. And what that means in effect is that a property's value is determined based on the sale of neighboring properties, and what is determined its highest and best use. So that means that every 4 years, a property is reassessed based on what it could be rather than what it is today. And so the more that we see these kind of large office and condo developments go up, the more that puts pressure on the existing small scale, 2-story, 3-story Main Street businesses. And so as this development continues, property values go up, and in some neighborhoods, they're skyrocketing. And what this does is it puts enormous pressure on the existing smaller scale buildings and the property owners and businesses responsible for paying those bills. So on Main Street stretches like downtown Yonge and in the King Spadina area, where there's a lot of rapid growth, this issue is particularly acute. So one striking example, which you may be familiar with, is that of Le Select Bistro, which is located on Wellington Street West, formerly on Queen Street West. It's facing two related challenges. It is facing a massive property tax bill, but it's also burdened by this incredible growth and construction that's happening on nearby sites, which also threatens business. In 2016, Le Select Bistro's building, which is a 2-story kind of former warehouse building, was reassessed at a value of $8 million, which is a 243% increase from its 2012 value. So that value is not based on its current form or its use, but on its hypothetical value as a tall condo or office tower like its neighbors. And while the business owners have no intention to sell, they're still responsible for paying these property tax bills, which they do not have the capacity to pay. It's a beloved local institution. People love this restaurant. It has 80 employees. Some of those employees have been working there for 30 and 40 years. So when we think about what is highest and best use, would you not consider that a great use of this space? Another example, again, similar to what Robert was speaking of in his earlier presentation, is that of Yonge Street, which faced huge property tax increases after the 2016 reassessment, some businesses facing increases of 100%. But we saw in that space businesses and property owners and the supportive city councillor, Kristen Wong-Tam, who you'll be hearing from soon, they banded together and mounted a campaign called the Yonge Street Tax Revolt. And together they were able to advocate for the city to implement that 10% cap as an interim measure. But despite this relief, we're still losing businesses on Yonge Street, as I'm sure you all know. They're facing a number of converging issues, and it's not just property taxes. It's changing retail patterns. It's, in the case of Cat's Cradle in the middle of the image here, they were formerly located in a space where there were lots of clothing boutiques in the area, women's clothing boutiques, and now that's simply not the case. So they're just not having the same amount of foot traffic and people shopping in the area for that sort of thing. And so in 2018, after 98 years as a family-owned business, they closed. Again, we're seeing the same patterns when it comes to creative spaces, and a great example is 401 Richmond, which faced an 84% tax increase from 2016 to 2020. So, as many of you know, 401 Richmond really helped lay the foundation for the kind of neighborhood that King Spadina is today. But the irony is that it really brought about the development potential that is now threatened by. Another similar example is many of the artscape spaces throughout the city. So like with the case of downtown Yonge, we saw cultural groups banding together to demand a solution from the city. And in 2017, they successfully advocated for the creation of a new property tax class that would allow them to receive a 50% reduction in their property tax rate. And that applies to about 20 cultural hubs throughout the city. But we have to question whether these interim measures are enough, and from all of our conversations and researching this, they are not. One of the key issues is that property tax is really complicated. The province, through the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, sets the assessed property values, and they determine the methodology around how they set those values. The city sets the tax rates, and they can also determine tax rebates. So depending on what solution you want, that will determine who you think is responsible for solving this issue. And there's also other hairy kind of elements of this, like you could create a new tax class, but how do you determine what counts as, for example, a small business? Is a small business determined based on the street frontage? Is it determined, like, do franchises count? Do upper floor businesses, like bookkeepers, is that a small business? So all of these questions kind of get brought up. In 2018, the city made a few additional recommendations for kind of potential directions that we could take when it comes to property tax. One of those being to request that the province adjust its methodology and no longer apply these highest and best use assessments. But as of the 2019 budget, the City of Toronto hasn't enacted any changes. So over and over again, when we were researching for this project, what we were hearing from tax experts, from business owners, from property owners, was that we need to really ask two questions when we're thinking about how to solve this problem. And they're quite simple, but they are, what are we losing and what do we want to preserve? So independent retailers, as we know, support neighborhood connections, they support street life, they add character to our main streets, they serve our communities. And so what are we losing when these businesses leave? And the second question is, what do we want to be preserving? Is it the businesses themselves? Is it the buildings? Is it the overall look and character and rhythm of the street? And so the province and the city, they have different tools to address these different outcomes. And so we need to be seeking clarity on those questions when determining what kinds of tools we want to deploy to actually move forward towards a solution. And so I think we'll talk a little bit about that more on our panel today. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to continuing this. Thanks.